"Detain him," Lieutenant Ryan Mercer said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the harbor, and just like that, every conversation along the pier seemed to collapse into silence as two sailors stepped forward, unsure but obedient, their boots scraping against sun-warmed concrete while the old man didn't move an inch, didn't raise his hands, didn't even look at them, his eyes fixed instead on the gray hull of the destroyer moored 50 yards away, its steel sides catching the late afternoon light in a dull, steady glow, as if it had seen this kind of moment before and chosen not to react. Samuel Whitaker stood there in a faded canvas jacket and worn work boots, the kind you'd find in any small-town hardware store, nothing about him matching the crisp uniforms surrounding him, nothing about him fitting the ceremony unfolding just beyond the barricade where officers in dress whites moved with quiet precision, preparing for a wreath-laying that carried more weight than most people on that pier could understand, but Mercer didn't see any of that. He saw a problem, a disruption, a name that didn't match his list and a presence that didn't belong, and that was enough. "You're claiming you were invited," Mercer continued, stepping closer, his posture rigid, authority worn like a second uniform, "but your name isn't on any clearance roster I have, so I'll ask you one more time. Who exactly do you think you are?" The question hung there, heavy, almost performative, drawing eyes from enlisted sailors, petty officers, even a few civilians gathered behind the ropes, and still, Samuel didn't answer right away. He just shifted his weight slightly, the faint creak of old leather barely audible under the distant clang of metal somewhere deeper in the shipyard, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying none of the defensiveness Mercer expected. "I'm not here for your list," he said, not looking at the lieutenant, not looking at anyone. "I'm here because I was told to be." Mercer let out a short, humorless breath, the kind that signaled patience wearing thin. "By who?" he pressed, already anticipating the answer would be weak, already certain this was going nowhere good, and Samuel's gaze lifted just enough to meet his, calm, unwavering. "Commander Elias Grant," he said, and for a split second, something flickered. Not in Mercer, but in the air itself, like a name that didn't quite belong in the mouth of a man dressed like that, standing where he stood, but Mercer pushed past it, dismissing the hesitation before it could take root. "Right," he replied, louder now, making sure others heard, "and I suppose you just walked in here because you felt like it, because you thought dropping a commander's name would get you through security." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the onlookers, not agreement, not quite doubt, just tension building in small, careful increments, and still, Samuel didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even shift his stance. He just looked back toward the ship again, as if Mercer's words were passing through him instead of landing, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate the lieutenant, because it wasn't resistance, it wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something harder to confront. "Sir," one of the sailors muttered, uncertain. "Should we hold him?" Mercer snapped, not taking his eyes off Samuel, "until we figure out exactly what game he's playing." And in that moment, under the wide American sky, with the wind carrying the faint scent of salt and diesel across the pier, the line between a simple misunderstanding and something far more serious began to blur, even if only one person there could feel it happening. The wind shifted slightly across the pier, carrying the distant echo of a ship bell and the low murmur of officers assembling near the ceremonial platform, but the space around Samuel Whitaker remained unnaturally still, as if the air itself had drawn a quiet boundary around him, and even the two sailors who had stepped in to hold him hesitated, their grip loose, uncertain, because there was something about the way he stood that did not match the situation he had been placed in, something composed, something unshaken, like a man who had already measured the outcome of this moment and found it unremarkable, while Lieutenant Ryan Mercer mistook that stillness for defiance, his jaw tightening as he circled half a step to the side, trying to force eye contact, trying to pull a reaction that never came. "You think dropping a name like that changes anything?" Mercer said, his voice lower now but sharper, more controlled, the kind of tone that carried authority meant to be felt as much as heard. "Commander Grant does not just invite civilians onto a restricted pier without documentation." Samuel finally turned his head, slow and deliberate, his eyes meeting Mercer's not with challenge, not with submission, but with a kind of quiet recognition that made the younger man pause for a fraction of a second longer than he intended. "I did not say I was invited like everyone else," Samuel replied, each word measured, as if he had no interest in convincing anyone, only in stating what was already true, and that answer, simple as it seemed to irritate Mercer even more because it offered no foothold, no argument to dismantle, no emotion to push against, just a statement that refused to bend. That is not how this works, Mercer shot back, raising his voice just enough for nearby personnel to hear, reinforcing his control of the situation. Everyone here goes through the same process, same clearance, same verification. That is how we maintain order. A few heads turned again, some curious, some uncomfortable, because the exchange had begun to feel less like routine enforcement and more like something that did not quite fit the setting, and through it all, Samuel's gaze drifted once more toward the destroyer, its deck now lined with sailors standing at ease, the ceremony moments away from beginning, the flag at half-mast stirring gently in the coastal breeze. Order, Samuel repeated quietly, almost to himself, the word carrying a weight that did not match its simplicity, as if it meant something different to him than it did to Mercer. And for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something older, something that flickered behind his eyes like a memory brushing against the present. I have seen what happens when order breaks, he added, not looking back at Mercer, and the sentence landed in a way that no raised voice could have, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to make one of the sailors glance at the other, unsure why the temperature of the moment had changed. Mercer exhaled sharply, dismissing the comment with a quick shake of his head, unwilling to let the tone shift away from his control. That is not relevant here, he said, stepping closer again, closing the distance as if proximity alone could re-establish authority. What is relevant is that you are standing in a restricted zone without clearance, claiming association with a commanding officer you cannot verify, which makes this look a lot like impersonation. The word hung there, sharper than the rest, drawing a faint reaction from the small cluster of onlookers, because now it was no longer just about access, it was about accusation, about character, about the kind of claim that could not be easily walked back. And still, Samuel did not react the way Mercer expected. He did not protest, did not raise his voice, did not even defend himself. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket with slow, careful movement, not as a gesture of urgency, but of familiarity, as if he had done it 1,000 times before, and withdrew something small, something dull in the afternoon light, holding it loosely in his palm without offering it forward yet, his eyes still on the ship, as if whatever he carried was not meant for the man questioning him, but for something far beyond this moment, something the rest of the pier had not yet begun to understand. The small object rested in Samuel Whitaker's palm, dull and worn, catching just enough light to reveal its edges but not enough to explain it, and that alone seemed to irritate Lieutenant Ryan Mercer more than anything else that had happened so far, because it was not evidence, not identification, not anything that fit neatly into the categories he understood. And yet Samuel held it with a kind of quiet certainty that suggested it mattered far more than any official credential ever could. What is that supposed to be? Mercer asked, extending his hand without waiting for permission, his tone laced with skepticism as he took the object between his fingers and turned it slightly, examining it like something pulled from a drawer and long forgotten. This is your proof, he added, loud enough for those nearby to hear, reinforcing the narrative he had already begun to build, that this man in front of him was out of place, unverified, and possibly pretending to be something he was not. And the sailors standing close shifted subtly, not stepping in, not stepping back, caught in that narrow space between duty and doubt, because the object did not look official. It was not polished, not engraved with any clear insignia that matched current standards, just a worn command coin, its surface softened by years of handling. The design nearly faded into something abstract. I have seen a lot of these, Mercer continued, holding it up slightly as if presenting it to an invisible jury. Souvenirs, replicas, things people pick up to make a story sound more convincing. A faint ripple moved through the onlookers, not agreement, not quite disagreement, just the uneasy awareness that the situation had crossed into something more personal, more public. And Samuel finally shifted his gaze from the ship to the coin now in Mercer's hand, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a quiet focus that made the space between them feel smaller, heavier. It is not for convincing anyone, Samuel said, his voice steady, each word placed carefully. It was given to me. Mercer let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. By who? He pressed again, already expecting the same answer, already prepared to dismiss it. But Samuel did not repeat himself this time, he simply watched the coin for a moment, as if seeing something layered beneath its worn surface, something no one else there could access. On a night your manuals never wrote down, he said, and the sentence landed differently than anything else he had said so far, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, like it carried a weight that did not need explanation, and for a brief second, Mercer hesitated, just enough for the moment to stretch, just enough for the certainty in his posture to flicker, before he closed his hand around the coin and stepped closer, reclaiming control of the interaction. That does not mean anything here, he said, firmer now, pushing past the hesitation. What matters is verification, documentation, chain of command, and right now you have none of that. He turned slightly, addressing the sailors again, reinforcing the structure he relied on. This is exactly how impersonation cases start: vague stories, emotional hooks, objects that look old enough to feel real. The word impersonation hung in the air again, heavier this time, drawing a tighter silence from those watching, because now the accusation was no longer implied, it was stated, clear and direct, and Samuel did not respond immediately. He simply extended his hand again, palm open, waiting, not demanding, just waiting, and something about that gesture, the absence of urgency, the absence of defense, made one of the sailors glance at Mercer with uncertainty. As if asking a question he could not put into words, but Mercer ignored it, placing the coin back into Samuel's hand with a controlled motion. You are going to stay right here until we verify every part of your story, he said, each word precise, deliberate, and if it does not check out, you will be escorted off this pier. Samuel closed his fingers around the coin, the movement slow, familiar, as if returning it to a place it had always belonged, and for the first time, he looked directly at Mercer again, not challenging, not yielding, just present, fully and completely. You can verify whatever you need, he said quietly, but it will not change what already happened. And that sentence, simple as it was, settled into the space between them with a weight that no raised voice could match, while somewhere beyond them, a whistle sounded from the ship, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. And yet no one on that stretch of pier seemed ready to move. The whistle from the destroyer carried across the water, long and low, signaling the final call before the ceremony, and for a moment the entire pier seemed to pause between movement and stillness. But Samuel Whitaker did not turn toward the sound, he did not shift his stance or acknowledge the urgency building around him. He simply stood there with the coin resting in his closed hand, his thumb tracing its worn edge with a slow, almost absent motion, and something in that small, repetitive gesture began to pull at the edges of his awareness, not outward toward the present, but inward, toward something older, something buried beneath decades of silence. And without warning, the world around him seemed to thin, the sharp lines of steel and uniform softening as memory pressed forward, not as a story, not as something to be told, but as something lived again, the air changing first, heavy, carrying the faint scent of heated metal and salt, the steady rhythm of the harbor replaced by a deeper vibration, the kind that traveled through the deck of a ship under strain. And suddenly he was no longer an old man standing on a quiet pier, he was younger, stronger, the night wrapped around him in shades of gray and shadow, the ocean stretching out beyond the hull in a dark, endless expanse, lights flickering along the deck as voices called out in controlled urgency, not panic, but something close to it, something held in check by discipline alone. And somewhere forward, beyond the bulkhead, a section of the ship had gone silent, not empty, but cut off, isolated in a way that every sailor recognized without needing it explained. Samuel moved without hesitation, his boots striking metal with purpose, the sound sharp against the low hum of the vessel, his hand closing around a piece of equipment that no one had told him to grab, because no one needed to, because some things did not come from orders, they came from knowing exactly what was at stake. And as he reached the sealed compartment, the heat pressed against him even through the steel, a reminder of how quickly things could turn, how little time there ever really was. Voices on the other side, faint, strained, and then the sound of someone calling out, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to carry through the barrier, enough to be heard by the one person close enough to matter. Samuel did not speak, he did not call back, he simply set his shoulder against the frame and worked with a precision that came from repetition, from experience that had been earned long before that night. And when the barrier finally gave, when the space opened just enough, he reached in without hesitation, his grip finding fabric, then a sleeve, then a wrist, pulling steady, controlled, not with force but with intent. Guiding rather than dragging, and out of that dim, strained space came a young officer, disoriented but conscious, his eyes locking onto Samuel's for a brief second that carried more than recognition, something deeper, something that would not fully settle until years later, and in that moment, with the ship still humming around them and the night pressing close, there were no ranks, no formalities. Just two men standing in a narrow corridor between what had almost been lost and what had been. Pulled back, and the young officer, still catching his breath, reached up with an unsteady hand, removing a coin from his own pocket, pressing it into Samuel's palm without ceremony, without explanation, just a simple gesture that carried its own meaning. "Keep it," he had said quietly, the words almost lost under the sound of the ship, and then the memory shifted. Not ending, not closing, but folding back into the present, the harbor returning, the pier solid beneath Samuel's feet once more, the coin still in his hand, its edges worn smooth by time, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was a subtle change in his expression, not visible enough for most to notice, but there, just beneath the surface, like something remembered not with words, but with weight, while in front of him, Lieutenant Ryan Mercer stood waiting, unaware that the object he had dismissed had just carried an entire night back into the light. The memory did not fade all at once, it receded slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind only the weight of what had been there, and Samuel Whitaker stood exactly where he had been before, the harbor air cool against his face, the distant movement of sailors returning to focus as if nothing had happened, but something had. Something inside him had shifted just enough to remind him that the past was never really gone, it simply waited for the right moment to surface, and as his fingers closed more firmly around the coin, the faint imprint of its worn design pressing into his skin, Lieutenant Ryan Mercer mistook that quiet stillness for hesitation, for uncertainty, and he leaned into it, reinforcing his position with the kind of confidence that came from believing he was still in control. "You are not helping your situation," Mercer said, his voice measured but firm, taking a step closer so that there was no space left for ambiguity. "If there is anything legitimate about your presence here, now is the time to make that clear." Samuel lifted his gaze again, not sharply, not defensively, just enough to meet Mercer's eyes, and there was something different in that look now, not stronger, not more intense, but more grounded, as if whatever had just passed through his mind had settled something that did not need to be explained. "It is already clear," Samuel replied quietly, and that answer, simple as it was, seemed to unsettle Mercer more than any argument could have, because it refused to engage on his terms, it did not offer proof, did not attempt persuasion, it simply existed as a statement that did not depend on being accepted, and around them, the tension continued to build in subtle ways. A petty officer standing 10 feet away shifted his stance, watching more closely now. A pair of sailors near the barricade exchanged a brief glance, not speaking, but aware that the situation was no longer routine, and from the edge of the gathering, Chief Petty Officer Owen Price had been observing the entire exchange without interruption, his arms folded loosely, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp, because there was something about the old man that did not align with what Mercer was describing. It was not just the calm, it was not just the lack of reaction, it was the details, small things that most people overlooked, the way Samuel had positioned himself slightly off the direct line of wind without looking, the way his eyes had tracked the ship earlier, not as a spectator but as someone reading it, understanding it, and most of all, the way he had spoken about order, not like someone repeating a concept, but like someone who had lived through its absence. Price's gaze shifted briefly to the coin now resting in Samuel's hand, then back to his face, and a faint unease settled in his chest, not fear, not alarm, just the sense that something important was being mishandled in real time. Mercer, unaware of that shift in perspective, continued forward, his tone tightening slightly as he tried to close the gap between authority and compliance. "You understand that invoking a commanding officer's name without verification is a serious matter," he said, emphasizing each word, "and until I receive confirmation, you are not authorized to be here." Samuel did not respond immediately, he simply turned his head slightly, looking once more toward the destroyer, its deck now fully arranged, sailors standing in quiet formation, the ceremony seconds away from beginning, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less steady. "Then you should make the call," he said, and for a brief moment, Mercer hesitated, not visibly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Price to see it, enough to confirm that the situation had moved beyond simple enforcement, because the old man was not resisting, he was not evading, he was inviting verification with a certainty that did not match the behavior of someone with something to hide, and that was the detail that finally tipped the balance. Price uncrossed his arms slowly, his decision forming. Not from rank, but from instinct, from years of experience that told him when something did not add up, and without drawing attention, he stepped back from the group, his hand moving to the radio at his shoulder, his voice low as he keyed it on, requesting a direct line to command, because whatever this was, it was no longer something that should be handled at the edge of a pier while a ceremony waited to begin. Chief Petty Officer Owen Price stepped just far enough away from the cluster of uniforms to keep his voice from carrying. The radio pressed lightly against his shoulder as the channel clicked open with a soft burst of static, and for a brief second he watched the scene behind him. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer still squared off against Samuel Whitaker, the old man unmoving, the ceremony now only moments from beginning, and then Price spoke. Low and precise, "Command, this is Chief Price on Pier 7. I need a verification check on a civilian claiming direct authorization from Commander Elias Grant." There was a pause on the line, not unusual, just the normal rhythm of communication, and then a voice responded, calm, procedural, asking for the name, and Price gave it clearly. "Samuel Whitaker," he said, each syllable deliberate, and something in the silence that followed was different, not long, not dramatic, but just enough to register, as if the name had landed somewhere it was not expected to. "Repeat that name," the voice said, a fraction slower this time, and Price felt that unease tighten slightly in his chest. "Samuel Whitaker," he repeated, his eyes drifting back toward the pier, watching Mercer's posture, watching Samuel's stillness, and then there was a shift on the other end, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that only someone who had spent years listening to command channels would recognize. Background noise dropping, voices lowering, a brief exchange too quiet to make out, and when the line came back, it was no longer the same voice. "Stand by," came the instruction, firmer now, carrying weight, and Price did not respond right away. He simply adjusted his stance, turning slightly so he could see both the pier and the ship, the destroyer's deck now fully manned, sailors in formation, the ceremony held in a suspended moment, waiting for something no one had announced yet, and behind him, Mercer's voice continued. Controlled but increasingly strained, pressing Samuel for answers that were not coming in the form he wanted, while Samuel remained exactly as he had been, the coin resting in his hand, his posture unchanged, as if time itself had slowed around him, and then the radio clicked again, sharper this time. "Chief Price, confirm visual," the new voice said, direct, authoritative, subject is male, approximately mid-80s, gray hair, civilian attire, holding a command coin. Price glanced once more, taking in the details he had already memorized. "Confirmed," he replied, and there was no immediate response, just a silence that stretched longer than protocol usually allowed, and in that silence, something shifted again, not on the pier, not in the air, but in the understanding of what this moment might actually be, and when the voice returned, it was different, not louder, not rushed, but carrying a level of control that signaled the situation had moved beyond routine verification. "Do not remove him," the voice said, each word clear, deliberate. "Repeat, do not remove him from that position." Price felt the weight of that instruction settle immediately, his posture straightening without conscious thought. "Understood," he answered, and then came the final line, the one that changed everything without raising its volume. "Commander Grant is en route," and the channel went quiet, leaving only the ambient sounds of the harbor and the distant preparation of the ceremony. But for Price, the space around him felt entirely different now, as if the pieces of something much larger had just begun to align, and he turned back toward the pier, stepping forward again with a measured pace, his expression neutral but his focus sharpened, because the situation was no longer about questioning a man who did not belong, it was about holding a moment in place until someone who did could arrive. While 10 yards away, Lieutenant Ryan Mercer stood unaware that the ground beneath his certainty had just begun to shift. The words from the radio had already changed the shape of the moment, even if no one else on the pier could hear them, and Chief Petty Officer Owen Price carried that shift back with him as he stepped into place, his posture no longer casual, his presence now deliberate, positioned just off Mercer's shoulder where he could see both the lieutenant and the old man without drawing attention to himself. But something in his stance was different, grounded, alert, and Samuel Whitaker noticed it immediately, not by looking directly, but by sensing the subtle recalibration of the space around him, the way one man's certainty had begun to anchor where another's had started to strain, while Lieutenant Ryan Mercer remained focused on the task in front of him, unaware that the situation had already moved beyond his control. "This is your final opportunity to clarify your status," Mercer said, his voice firm, measured, holding on to authority like a line pulled tight, "because once this ceremony begins, I will not have the flexibility to continue this discussion." The statement sounded procedural, but there was an edge beneath it now, a trace of urgency that had not been there before, and Samuel did not respond right away. He simply looked past Mercer for a brief moment, toward the ship, where the formation had locked into place, rows of white uniforms aligned with quiet precision, the flag shifting gently in the coastal wind, everything ready, everything waiting, and then he returned his gaze, calm as ever. "Then you should not delay it on my account," he said, and the simplicity of the answer landed heavier than expected, not dismissive, not defiant, just indifferent to the pressure Mercer was trying to apply, and that indifference was what unsettled him most, because it did not fit the pattern. It did not respond the way it was supposed to, and before he could press further, Price spoke, his voice low but clear, cutting cleanly into the exchange without raising itself. "Lieutenant," he said, and Mercer turned slightly, irritation flickering for an instant at being interrupted. "Chief," he acknowledged, his tone controlled, "I have this handled." Price did not challenge that directly, did not contradict him in front of the others, he simply held his position and added, "Command is verifying." The words were neutral, procedural, but the way he said them carried something else, something that made Mercer pause for half a beat longer than he intended. "Good," Mercer replied, reclaiming his focus, "then we will have clarity shortly," but the certainty in his voice was thinner now, stretched across something he could not quite define, and around them, the atmosphere continued to tighten, the small group of onlookers no longer shifting or murmuring, just watching, sensing that the moment had reached a point where something was about to change, even if they did not know how, and Samuel remained at the center of it all, still, composed, the coin resting quietly in his hand, not displayed, not hidden, simply there, as if it had already served its purpose and did not need to prove anything further. While the seconds stretched longer than they should have, the ceremony delayed without announcement, the ship waiting, the pier holding its breath, and then, from the far end of the dock, a subtle movement began, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in attention as a figure stepped into view, walking with measured purpose, accompanied by two officers who kept a respectful distance, and even before the details became clear, before rank or insignia could be read, something in the way the path opened ahead of him, the way conversation stopped without being told to, signaled that the balance of authority was about to change, and Chief Price saw it first, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, while Lieutenant Mercer, still focused on Samuel, had not yet turned, not yet realized that the confirmation he had been waiting for was no longer coming through a radio, but walking directly toward him. The figure approaching from the far end of the dock did not raise his voice, did not signal ahead, and yet the space around him shifted as if responding to an unspoken command, sailors stepping subtly aside, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, and by the time Lieutenant Ryan Mercer finally turned, drawn by the sudden stillness behind him, it was already too late to control the moment. Because Commander Elias Grant was no longer a distant presence, he was there, closing the last few yards. With a steady, deliberate stride, his uniform immaculate, his expression composed but unreadable, and the officers following behind him slowed to a halt several steps back, leaving him to continue alone, and Mercer straightened immediately, instinct taking over as he snapped to attention. "Commander," he began, his voice sharp, ready to present the situation in the structure he understood. But Grant did not acknowledge him right away, his attention moving past Mercer without hesitation, settling instead on the man standing just beyond him, and for the first time since he had entered the scene, something changed in Grant's face, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to most, but enough, a subtle recognition that carried weight, that carried history, and he stepped forward, closing the remaining distance until he stood directly in front of Samuel Whitaker, the two men facing each other in a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the harbor quiet, the ship waiting, every eye on the pier fixed on what would happen next, and then Grant's gaze dropped slightly, not to Samuel's face, but to his hand, to the coin resting There, its worn surface catching the light just enough to reveal what remained of its design, and Grant's expression tightened, not in anger, not in confusion, but in recognition so immediate it erased any doubt that might have existed, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than Mercer's had been, quieter, but it carried farther. "Where did you get that?" The question was not an accusation, not a challenge. It was something else entirely, something closer to confirmation than inquiry, and Samuel did not hesitate this time. He did not look away, he simply met Grant's eyes and answered, "You gave it to me," and the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not need elaboration, and for a fraction of a second, time seemed to stop, the kind of pause that does not come from confusion but from the sudden alignment of memory and reality, and then Grant inhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, as if steadying something that had just surfaced, and he reached out, not to take the coin, but to lightly touch its edge, his fingers brushing against the worn metal with a familiarity that could not be faked, and when he looked back up, there was no hesitation left, no uncertainty, only certainty that carried its own authority. "Stand down," he said, not loudly, but the command cut clean through the air, directed not at Samuel, but at everything around him, at Mercer, at the sailors, at the tension itself, and Mercer froze, his posture still rigid. His mind catching up to what had just happened, because the shift was absolute, not partial, not conditional, absolute, and Grant straightened, his voice now carrying across the pier with quiet precision. "This man is Samuel Whittaker," he said, each word deliberate, "and he is exactly where he is supposed to be," and the effect was immediate. The accusation dissolved without argument, without explanation, replaced by a silence that was heavier than any reprimand, because it did not need to raise its volume to make its point, and Mercer felt it then, the realization not spoken but understood, that everything he had built his certainty on had just been overturned in a single sentence, while Samuel remained still, unchanged. The same quiet presence he had been from the beginning, as if the moment had not elevated him, but simply revealed what had always been there. For a few seconds after Commander Elias Grant spoke, no one moved, not the sailors along the pier, not the officers standing near the ceremony platform, not even the wind that seemed to hesitate as it passed over the water, because the weight of what had just been said settled over everything like a quiet command that did not need to be repeated, and Lieutenant Ryan Mercer remained exactly where he stood, his posture still locked in formality, but the certainty that had held him upright only moments ago had shifted into something far less stable, something that did not show on his uniform but was unmistakable in the way his eyes no longer held the same confidence. While Grant did not raise his voice or extend the moment with explanation, he simply stepped half a pace closer to Samuel Whittaker, his tone lowering again, no longer addressing the pier, but the man in front of him. "You should have told them," he said, not as a reprimand, not as a demand, but as a quiet acknowledgement of how easily this could have been avoided, and Samuel gave the smallest shake of his head, almost imperceptible. "They were doing their job," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, no trace of complaint, just a simple statement that carried more understanding than any defense could have, and that answer, more than anything else, seemed to settle the last remaining tension in the space, because it removed the need for blame, for correction, for anything beyond recognition, and Grant nodded once, a brief motion, before turning slightly toward the formation waiting by the ship, where the ceremony had been held in a suspended silence that now began to shift again, not rushed, not disrupted, but realigning around the presence that had just been confirmed, and when he spoke next, it was not loudly, but with the kind of clarity that carried without effort. "We are proceeding," he said, and the words moved through the line of sailors like a signal, posture tightening, attention sharpening, the ceremony falling back into place as if it had only paused to make room for something more important, and then Grant looked back at Samuel, extending a hand not as an order, not as a formality, but as an invitation. "Walk with me," he said, and Samuel did not hesitate, he stepped forward. With the same steady movement he had shown from the beginning, not elevated by the moment, not changed by it, simply continuing forward as if this had always been where he was meant to be, and as they moved side by side toward the center of the formation, the space opened naturally, not commanded, not forced, but given, sailors stepping aside with a quiet awareness that did not need to be explained, while behind them, Mercer finally exhaled, the breath leaving him slower than it should have. His posture easing just enough to reveal the shift that had taken place, not humiliation, not defeat, but something quieter, something heavier, the realization that authority without understanding could lead a man to stand in front of someone he should have recognized, and fail to see him, and he did not speak, did not attempt to correct or justify, because there was nothing left to say that would carry the same weight as what had already been revealed, and at the front of the formation, as the ceremony resumed, Samuel Whittaker stood not as a guest, not as an exception, but as a presence that fit seamlessly into the moment, the coin still resting in his hand, unseen by most, but understood by the one man who needed no further proof, and as the first notes of the ceremony carried across the water, low and steady, the entire pier seemed to settle into a different kind of silence, one that was not built from tension, but from recognition, because some truths did not arrive with rancor paperwork, they arrived in quiet ways, and when they did, everything else had no choice but to make room.